The Lord is with you every step of the way in your hike for Jesus. God bless you all. Your friend, Chuck Norris.
They put his face on church bulletins, pastors quoted him from the pulpit, Christian bookstores sold his books right next to the Bible. And the whole time, Chuck Norris was practicing something else entirely. Not Christianity, not the faith he publicly endorsed for decades. Something older, something that most of his fans have never heard of. And when you learn what it is, every interview he ever gave will suddenly make a very different kind of sense. But that's not even the strangest part. The strangest part is that the clues were always there, hidden in plain sight, in the things he said, in the places he traveled, in the philosophy he studied obsessively for over 30 years. And nobody, not a single journalist, not a single biographer, ever connected the dots. Until now. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about the most famous martial artist in American history. It's 1950. A 7-year-old boy named Carlos Ray Norris is sitting in a pew in Ryan, Oklahoma, a town so small it barely exists on a map. His mother, Wilma, is singing hymns. His father, Ray, is never there. Ray is drunk somewhere, or gone somewhere, or both. Carlos, the boy the world will one day call Chuck, grows up in the church by default, not by conviction, by geography, by poverty, by the simple fact that church is the only place in Ryan, Oklahoma, where a broken family can feel briefly whole. He is shy, painfully shy. He has no father, he has no confidence, he has no sense of who he is. And that is the wound that drives everything that comes next. Because when Chuck Norris discovers martial arts at the age of 18, as a young Air Force serviceman stationed in South Korea, he doesn't just find a sport, he finds a philosophy, a complete system for understanding the self, the world, and the nature of reality. He doesn't talk about this period much. Almost no one does. But this is where the story really begins. It's 1962. Chuck Norris is 22 years old, standing barefoot on a cold dojo floor in Osan, South Korea. His instructor is teaching him Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art with roots stretching back over 1,000 years. Roots that go not into Christianity, but into Taoism, into Buddhism, into a worldview where the universe operates according to invisible principles, energy, balance, flow, emptiness. Nobody talks about this part. Tang Soo Do is not a fighting system with a philosophy attached to it. It is a philosophy expressed through fighting. The Korean masters who developed it were deeply influenced by Taoist thought. The idea that the universe has a natural order, that the goal of the disciplined person is to align with that order, not to impose their will upon it. Chuck Norris absorbs this every day for years. When he returns to the United States and begins competing and winning on the national circuit, he doesn't just bring his kicks and his punches. He brings this worldview with him, this quiet, Eastern, non-Christian framework for understanding existence. And here is where it gets strange. Because in 1969, the same year he opens his first martial arts school in California, Chuck Norris begins studying something that will quietly define the rest of his intellectual and spiritual life. Something his publicists never highlighted, something his Christian publisher never mentioned. He begins studying philosophy. Seriously, obsessively, and not Western philosophy, not the kind they teach in Sunday school. He starts with the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism, written by the ancient Chinese sage Laozi. 81 short passages that describe a universe governed not by a personal God who intervenes in human affairs, but by an impersonal force, the Tao, that flows through all things. He reads it, he rereads it, he incorporates its principles into the curriculum of his martial arts schools. This is not speculation, this is documented. Chuck Norris himself said in a 1999 interview with Black Belt magazine that the Tao Te Ching was one of the most influential texts of his life. Let that land for a second. The man whose face appeared on the cover of Christian parenting books, the man who co-authored a book called Black Belt Patriotism that drew heavily on evangelical rhetoric. That man called a 2,500-year-old Taoist text one of the most influential books of his life. You're probably thinking, okay, maybe he just read it, maybe it was passing intellectual curiosity, maybe it didn't really change anything. But here's where you'd be wrong. There is something every person who has ever trained with Chuck Norris mentions, something they struggle to put into words. It is not his speed, it is not his strength, it is a quality of stillness. Not the stillness of a man who is calm, the stillness of a man who has made peace with emptiness. That word, emptiness, is not a casual choice. In Taoist and Buddhist philosophy, emptiness is not a negative concept. It is the source of all potential. The cup must be empty before it can hold water. The mind must be empty before it can act without hesitation. Chuck Norris built his entire fighting philosophy around this concept. He called it being present. His students called it terrifying. But Chuck Norris did not use the word Tao in his interviews. He did not use the word Buddhist. He used Christian language. He spoke of God. He spoke of prayer. He spoke of faith. Why? That is the question that changes everything, and the answer is one nobody has ever said out loud. Here is what we know, documented and verifiable. In 1975, Chuck Norris marries his second wife, Gina O'Kelly. Gina is a devout Christian. Her faith is central to her identity, her community, her sense of family. And Chuck, the man who grew up fatherless in a church he attended but never fully inhabited, Chuck loves her deeply, and he makes a decision, not a dramatic conversion, not a bolt of lightning, a quiet, private decision to adopt the language of his wife's world, to speak in terms she and their community would understand, to become, publicly, the Christian figure they needed him to be. This is not cynicism. This is not manipulation. This is what people do for the people they love. They learn a new vocabulary for truths they already hold. Because here is the thing about Chuck Norris and the Tao. The Tao teaches that the universe operates on moral principles, that justice, though slow, is inevitable, that discipline creates virtue, that the strong should protect the weak, that the self must be surrendered for something larger. These are not foreign ideas to a Christian audience. They are the same ideas, expressed differently, arrived at through a different door. And this is the thing that nobody, not his critics, not his fans, not his biographers, has ever properly reckoned with. Now, you probably think the story ends there. A man who privately holds a philosophical worldview and publicly performs a religious one. A story about the gap between private belief and public identity. But it doesn't end there. Because in 2013, quietly, with almost no media coverage, Chuck Norris gave an interview to a small podcast called The Art of Manliness. And in it, he said something extraordinary. He was asked about the nature of consciousness, about what happens after we die. And instead of giving the standard Christian answer, heaven, resurrection, eternal life, he paused, longer than anyone expected. And then he said this. He said that he believed consciousness was not something the brain produces, that it is something the universe has always contained, that individual minds are like waves on the ocean, temporary shapes taken by something much larger, much older, and much more permanent than any single human life. That is not a Christian answer. That is not even close to a Christian answer. That is a description of what Taoists call the Tao, what Buddhists call the Dharmakaya, what some physicists call the quantum field. It is the oldest philosophical idea in human history, that consciousness is not personal, but universal, not created, but discovered. And Chuck Norris, at 73 years old, in a small interview that almost no one heard, said it plainly. Without the Christian vocabulary, without the evangelical framing, just the raw, unmediated belief he had carried inside him since a cold dojo floor in 1962. So what do we do with this? Not the Chuck Norris of the memes, not the Chuck Norris of the church bulletins, the real one, the one who spent 30 years reading Taoist texts and never quite said so, the one who used Christian language to describe a non-Christian experience of the sacred, the one who found God, or whatever you want to call it, not in a church in Oklahoma, but on a training floor in Korea, in the space between a breath and a strike. There is something almost unbearably human about that. A man who carries his truest beliefs quietly, who speaks the language of those he loves, who finds eventually, in the last stretch of a long life, a moment of complete honesty in a small podcast no one was really listening to. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Does it matter what someone calls their beliefs? If the way they live those beliefs is indistinguishable from love. Chuck Norris spent decades helping children, funding schools, visiting veterans, protecting the vulnerable, whatever he called that. Tao, God, the universe, consciousness. He lived it. Maybe that's the only theology that has ever mattered. Or maybe you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think what you call something is everything. Maybe you think the doctrine is the point. Leave that answer below, because I genuinely want to know. Because one thing is certain, the man they called a Christian icon spent 60 years practicing the oldest philosophy on earth, and never once stopped.